In 2004, contractors of the American mortuary system ordered more than 2 million feet of industrial plastic sheeting in a single fiscal cycle. Most of it never appeared in public photographs. Most of it never appeared in news reports. It moved through loading bays of air bases, through refrigerated containers, through temporary collection points built from canvas and plywood and fluorescent lights. One logistics officer later described the sound before he described the smell. He said the loudest thing in the room was the tearing of plastic from the rolled dot in the wars of the 20th century. Bodies often returned in wood, canvas, or metal. In the 21st, many returned sealed in layers of polymer and adhesive. The material looked clean. That frightened people, families, began asking the same question in different forms. Why wrap the dead like cargo? Why layer plastic around a human body before transport, storage, identification, or burial? Why did soldiers, coroners, disaster teams, and funeral contractors in different countries start using the same methods at the same time? And beneath those questions sat another. 1. Was the wrapping meant to protect the living or hide something from them? One lesser-known detail of disaster logistics is that industrial stretch film became cheaper per foot than many traditional containment materials after global petrochemical expansion during the 1980s and 1990s. That shift quietly changed procurement decisions inside hospitals, military systems, and emergency management agencies. The first explanation sounds simple. Hygiene, disease prevention, containment of fluids. That answer appears in public health. Manuals from outbreaks of cholera, Ebola, influenza, and mass casualty disasters. A sealed body reduces leakage during transport. A sealed body protects vehicles, workers, and storage areas. The logic seems obvious, but contradiction appears almost immediately. Many wrapped bodies were not infectious. Records from military mortuary facilities, civilian coroners, and disaster response teams show the same practice used on trauma victims with no known contagious disease. Victims of explosions, floods, structural collapse, heat stroke, gunfire, even bodies already placed inside bags or coffins were sometimes wrapped again. A lesser-known fact of military mortuary doctrine is that secondary wrapping procedures expanded sharply after lessons learned from aircraft cargo contamination incidents during the Gulf War. In several cases, leaked fluids forced repeated decontamination of transport bays and damaged sensitive equipment. The second explanation is preservation. Plastic slows exposure to air. It limits moisture transfer for a short time. It stabilizes transport conditions. Funeral workers often describe it as practical rather than symbolic. Yet pathologists disagree on how useful full sealing actually is for long-duration preservation. Some reports suggest aggressive sealing can accelerate visible decomposition if temperature control fails. Moisture becomes trapped, heat remains. Bacteria continue working inside a closed environment. One medical examiner from the American South once compared poorly refrigerated wrapped remains to produce left in a hot vehicle. The comparison disturbed families enough that some agencies stopped discussing the process publicly. A lesser-known detail from mortuary science journals is that body refrigeration standards differ widely between counties, states, and countries. In some mass fatality situations, wrapping compensated for shortages of refrigeration rather than replacing it. Then came another explanation. Insomnia.official argued that wrapping concealed traumatic injuries from families and from personnel during transport. In military settings, officials spoke about dignity. In disaster zones, responders spoke about shielding survivors from further trauma. Again, the reasoning carried emotional weight. Again, contradiction followed. Several soldiers who worked in casualty affairs units later admitted that standardized wrapping procedures sometimes made the dead feel less human rather than more protected. One described rows of identical sealed forms under fluorescent lights. Another compared the visual effect to warehouse inventory. A lesser-known operational note from early NATO mortuary planning warned that excessive standardization of remains handling could psychologically distance personnel from casualties and increase emotional detachment during prolonged operations. Another explanation blamed television. Governments learned during previous wars that images of damaged bodies altered public support. The Vietnam War became the reference point of almost every later media strategy. Plastic, sealed containers, transfer cases, and restricted photography all appeared connected in the public imagination. The theory gained traction because officials repeatedly restricted cameras during repatriation operations. But the timeline complicates the story. Shrink wrapping and industrial sealing procedures expanded inside civilian disaster management at the same time. Earthquakes in Turkey, tsunamis in Asia, hurricane response operations in the United States, train crashes in Europe, pandemic planning exercises in multiple countries. The same materials kept appearing. A lesser-known procurement pattern after. The attacks of September 11th showed emergency agencies dramatically increasing purchases of portable containment materials, including heavy-duty plastic, film, and temporary mortuary supplies designed for rapid deployment. Another explanation focused on identification, wrap the body, secure the evidence, preserve clothing, fragments, personal effects, and biological material, reduce chain of custody errors. That explanation carried strong support from forensic teams, yet even here, investigators found disagreement. Some forensic specialists argued that overhandling during wrapping increased the chance of contamination or loss of trace evidence. Others argued that rapid containment reduced exactly those risks. One disaster investigator summarized the problem in a single sentence. The dead were being managed by systems designed for speed. A lesser-known fact from international disaster victim identification protocols is that labeling errors historically increased during transitions between recovery teams and transport teams rather than during laboratory examination itself. People also blamed economics. Plastic is cheap, wood is not, metal is expensive, emergency systems increasingly operate under budget pressure. A roll of industrial stretch film costs little compared to specialized containment systems. But economics alone cannot explain the emotional force of the practice, because the anger was never only about material. It was about appearance, about what industrial methods say about the value of a body, about the fear that modern institutions treat death like freight. A lesser-known fact from funeral industry consolidation reports is that large corporate ownership of funeral services accelerated the adoption of standardized packaging and transport procedures across multiple regions during the late 20th century. Then another possibility emerged. Not concealment, not efficiency, fear, the fear of workers, the fear of lawsuits, the fear of contamination, the fear of mistakes, the fear of mistakes, the fear of photographs. The fear of odor. The fear of memory. That possibility sounds abstract until you look at the evidence trail left behind by wars, pandemics, and disasters. One of the clearest threads begins on battlefields during earlier wars. Many armies recovered bodies using blankets, ponchos, canvas covers, or improvised stretchers. The systems often collapsed under scale. In Korea and Vietnam, recovery teams worked in heat that accelerated decomposition within hours. Helicopter crews complained about fluid leakage. Vehicle crews improvised barriers using tarps and fuel-resistant liners. By the Gulf War, military planners had begun redesigning mortuary logistics around aviation compatibility. Aircraft mattered more than ceremonies, but it has had to move rapidly across continents. A lesser-known logistics lesson from Operation Desert Storm involved repeated complaints from cargo crews about odor penetration inside transport aircraft carrying remains during long-range flights. In Iraq and Afghanistan, casualty evacuation became faster than in most previous wars. Advanced trauma systems saved people who once would have died immediately. Yet many still died later in surgery, during transport, or from catastrophic injuries impossible to survive. The modern military death chain became highly technical. Collection point, transfer. Point. Refrigeration, identification, preparation, air transport, reception. Each link demanded containment. Personnel from Dover Air Force Base later described strict handling protocols designed partly around preserving uniform appearance and preventing leakage during international transfer. The public rarely saw the intermediate stages. That absence created suspicion, i.e., lesser-known detail from mortuary affairs training manuals, is that responders are taught methods of moving remains with minimal visual exposure, specifically to reduce psychological shock among untrained personnel nearby. Another evidence thread runs through civilian disasters. After the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, thousands of bodies decomposed in tropical heat before identification teams could process them. Rumors spread almost instantly that dead bodies would trigger massive epidemics. Public health experts repeatedly stated that most disaster victims do not create major disease outbreaks, yet authorities still sealed, wrapped, bagged, and buried bodies rapidly. Why? Partly because panic spreads faster than bacteria. A lesser-known fact from disaster sociology studies is that communities often overestimate disease risk from corpses while underestimating contamination from damaged water systems and sanitation collapse. During Hurricane Katrina, recovery teams moved through flooded neighborhoods in extreme heat. Refrigeration systems failed. Morgues overflowed. Temporary storage solutions appeared in parking lots and improvised facilities. Workers wrapped bodies not only for transport but because infrastructure itself had broken apart. One Louisiana official later admitted that the visual management of death became a political issue within days. Images of exposed remains suggested governmental collapse. Sealed remains suggested control. A lesser-known operational detail from Katrina response records is that refrigerated trucks used for food distribution were temporarily repurposed for human remains storage in several areas. Then came the pandemic years, and the argument changed completely. In hospitals during COVID-19, body handling procedures became symbols of fear. Nurses sealed remains quickly. Families often could not touch or wash bodies, according to religious tradition. Funeral homes faced surges. Beyond normal capacity, plastic barriers appeared everywhere, on stretchers, around coffins, across visitation rooms, inside temporary morgues. One funeral director described entire days spent hearing the sound of tape sealing bags. A lesser-known fact from early pandemic guidance is that several countries adopted stricter body handling procedures before strong evidence existed regarding transmission risk from corpses themselves. This is where the investigation begins, changing direction, because the deeper evidence suggests that shrink wrapping of the dead is not really one practice. It is the visible surface of several systems, colliding medicine, logistics, psychology, media, law, industrial, manufacturing, and war. One thread leads into training culture. Mortuary workers, disaster responders, and soldiers repeatedly describe the same emotional adaptation. Procedure replaces ritual. Checklists replace. Improvisation. Standardization reduces hesitation. A body becomes a sequence of required actions. Tag, photograph, secure, wrap, transport. The system depends on repetition, because repetition reduces error, but repetition also changes perception. A lesser-known finding from trauma psychology researches that ritualized procedures can reduce immediate emotional overload among responders while increasing delayed psychological stress later. Training manuals rarely discuss grief directly. They discuss contamination, zones, lifting angles, documentation standards, temperature requirements, packaging failures. One military instructor reportedly told trainees that hesitation causes mistakes and mistakes dishonor the dead. That phrase appears humane, yet it also transforms emotion into operational performance. A lesser-known aspect of forensic recovery, training, is the emphasis on maintaining professional detachment during mass casualty events to prevent cognitive overload and identification errors. Supply chains tell another part of the story. Industrial plastic did not become dominant because of funeral tradition. It became dominant because modern logistics systems already depended on it everywhere else. Pallets, medical shipments, food transport, military cargo, warehouse inventory. Stretch film became universal infrastructure when emergency planners needed scalable containment. The material already existed in enormous quantities. One procurement analyst later explained it bluntly: you use what the supply chain can deliver immediately. A lesser-known detail from emergency preparedness planning is that many national stockpiles prioritize multi-purpose industrial materials because specialized mortuary supplies may expire, degrade, or remain unused for years. Then there is maintenance. Not maintenance of bodies, maintenance of systems. Aircraft require decontamination after leakage incidents. Vehicles require cleaning. Storage facilities require odor control. Workers require protective equipment. The RAP in protected institutions. From operational disruption as much as it protected workers from exposure. That distinction matters because institutions optimize for continuity. A lesser-known issue documented in transport operations is that biofluid leakage can ground aircraft temporarily for sanitation procedures, delaying unrelated missions and increasing operational costs. Psychological effect forms another threat. Soldiers returning from war often remembered the wrapped dead more vividly than active combat. Aid workers from earthquakes and floods described rows of sealed forms lined side by side under floodlights. The uniformity produced a surreal effect. One Red Cross. Volunteers said the wrapping removed individuality and amplified scale at the same time. Every shape looked anonymous, every shape looked human. A lesser-known observation from disaster anthropology is that concealment of facial features can intensify emotional projection among survivors because the imagination fills missing details with fear. Enemy adaptation appears in unexpected ways to insurgent groups and extremists. Organizations learned quickly that imagery of bodies influences morale and politics. Some targeted funeral routes, others released graphic footage specifically to bypass official visual controls. Governments responded with tighter handling procedures. Containment became information. Management. Not only sanitation. A lesser-known detail from counterinsurgency communication studies is that military planners increasingly viewed casualty imagery as part of the information battlefield during the Iraq War. Then the investigation encountered a report rarely discussed outside emergency management circles. A planning assessment from a mass fatality exercise warned that the greatest risk during catastrophic events was not decomposition, not infection, not even identification failure. The greatest risk was collapse of public confidence. If citizens believed authorities could not manage the dead, panic spread rapidly. That sentence changes everything because it reframes the wrapping. The plastic was not only around bodies, it was around perception, a lesser-known finding from crisis communication. Research is that visible disorder involving human remains produces disproportionately high public distrust compared to many larger infrastructure failures. Now the older contradictions begin fitting together. Why wrap known infectious bodies? Because leakage, odor, and appearance still affect morale, transport, and institutional credibility. Why use industrial materials? because modern emergency systems depend on scalable logistics more than ceremonial craftsmanship. Why continue even when preservation benefits are limited? Because the objective is not long-term preservation alone. It is controlled movement through bureaucratic systems. A lesser-known procurement note from several emergency agencies described human remains handling as a transportation management issue as much as a medical issue. The turning point of the investigation came from testimony given quietly by people who handled the dead every day: funeral workers, mortuary technicians, recovery personnel. Most did not describe disrespect. Most described volume, too many bodies. Too little time, too few workers, too much heat, too many legal requirements, too many grieving families, waiting for certainty. One mortuary technician said something investigators kept hearing in different forms. The public imagines death as ritual. Systems experience it as logistics. A lesser-known fact from urban planning studies is that many cities possess far less surge morgue capacity than the public assumes. Relying heavily on temporary expansion plans during disasters, that does not mean symbolism disappears. Quite the opposite. Plastic gained symbolic power precisely because it looked industrial. It resembled packaging, warehouse material, freight handling. Modern civilization already wraps nearly everything in polymer: food, machinery, medicine, furniture, weapons. The dead entering that same visual language disturbed people because it implied incorporation into the machinery of systems. A lesser-known observation from visual culture researchers is that transparent materials around the dead often produce stronger public discomfort than opaque coverings because they evoke clinical inspection rather than ritual separation. Different cultures reacted differently. In some Islamic traditions, rapid burial and ritual washing hold enormous importance. During pandemics and disasters, restrictions on body handling created intense tension between public health rules and religious obligation. In parts of Europe and North America, professional funeral systems already separated families from direct body preparation long before modern disasters. Industrialization had changed death gradually over more than a century. The wrapping only made the change visible. A lesser-known historical detail is that home preparation of the dead remained common in many Western regions well into the early 20th century before professional funeral industries centralized the process. Another thread leads back to warfare. Modern militaries increasingly promise rapid return of remains. During earlier conflicts, soldiers were often buried overseas, temporarily or permanently. Advances in refrigeration, aviation, and forensic identification changed expectations. Families came to expect return. Return required systems. Systems required standardization. Standardization required containment. The chain is brutally practical. A lesser-known logistical milestone occurred during the Korean War when expanded use of refrigerated transport and systematic repatriation reshaped American military mortuary doctrine. A lesser-known logistical milestone occurred during the Korean War when expanded use of refrigerated transport and systematic repatriation reshaped American military mortuary doctrine. But another contradiction appears. Even highly standardized systems still fail. Misidentifications occur, delays happen, storage shortages emerge. During several disasters, bodies remained in temporary containment for far longer than intended because identification processes stalled. DNA analysis takes time. Paperwork fails. Families disagree. Jurisdictions clash. A lesser-known issue from mass fatality investigations is that fragmented remains dramatically increase identification timelines and storage requirements. This is why many responders defend containment practices so strongly. Not because the methods are emotionally satisfying, because alternatives can become worse very quickly. Exposure, odor, contamination, misplacement, accelerated. decomposition, loss of evidence. Yet critics still argue something essential disappears when death becomes procedural. And evidence supports that concern too. Workers exposed repeatedly to industrialized death management sometimes develop severe emotional detachment. Others experience delayed trauma, substance abuse, insomnia, or recurring sensory memories. Several studies of disaster responders found that smell memories persisted longer than visual memories. That detail explains part of the obsession with sealing and containment. Odor is not only biological, it is psychological. A lesser-known fact from neuroscience research is that smell processing links closely to emotional memory systems, making odor-triggered trauma especially persistent. The investigation also uncovered another uncomfortable truth. Plastic wrapping expanded partly because modern societies became less accustomed to direct contact with death. Earlier generations often encountered death at home. Children saw bodies, families prepared remains, communities handled burial directly. Modern urban populations increasingly encountered death through institutions, hospitals, funeral homes, emergency systems. The less familiar death became, the more institutions emphasized controlled presentation. A lesser-known demographic trend shows that rates of home death care declined sharply across industrialized nations during the 20th century as medicalized death increased. There is also the matter of law. Lawsuits involving contamination, transport failure, mishandling, or exposure incidents pushed agencies toward more aggressive containment practices. Insurance systems rewarded risk reduction. One legal advisor described body handling protocols as partly shaped by the language of liability rather than the language of mourning. That sentence reveals another layer. The dead move through systems designed by the living, and the living fear consequences. A lesser-known factor in mortuary policy development is the influence of occupational safety regulations, governing blood-borne pathogen exposure during transport and handling. At this point, the central question changes. Not why we wrap our dead, but why the wrapping unsettles us so deeply. Part of the answer lies in transparency. Plastic reveals shape without revealing identity. It creates distance while preserving outline. That combination triggers unease. The body becomes simultaneously present and absent. A philosopher of disaster imagery once described sealed remains as evidence of modernity attempting to control mortality through procedure. A lesser-known observation from museum conservation experts is that transparent barriers around human remains alter emotional response more strongly than solid enclosures because viewers focus on containment itself. Then another hidden thread emerged. Climate. Heat changed everything. Many modern mass fatality procedures evolved not in comfortable mortuary environments but in tropical disasters, desert wars, flooded cities, and power outages. High temperatures accelerate decomposition rapidly. Workers under those conditions prioritize containment because time becomes an enemy. One recovery worker from Southeast Asia described bodies changing visibly within hours under sun exposure. A lesser-known operational reality is that decomposition, where ATEs can increase dramatically above standard refrigeration thresholds, complicating identification and transport. Technology added another layer. Portable refrigeration units. Chemical absorbents, industrial adhesives, tracking labels, DNA, kits. Digital records. The body became integrated into data, systems, barcode errors mattered, documentation mattered, chain of custody mattered. Wrap and stabilize not only physical remains, but administrative flow. A lesser-known detail from forensic management systems is that mislabeled remains can trigger years of legal and emotional consequences for families and agencies alike. Some critics argue that industrial handling reflects moral decline. Evidence suggests something more complicated. The same systems accused of dehumanization also enabled unprecedented identification accuracy and repatriation rates. Earlier wars left enormous numbers unidentified forever. Modern forensic systems recover names that once would have vanished. That achievement depends partly on rigorous containment and documentation. The paradox sits at the center of the investigation. Methods that appear cold sometimes emerge from attempts to preserve identity, a lesser-known success of post-conflict. Forensic science is the identification of thousands of previously unknown victims from Balkan mass graves using DNA-based recovery systems. Still, visual symbolism matters. During the Iraq War, restrictions on photographing returning coffins generated controversy because many Americans believed the government was hiding the human cost of war. Officials argued the rules protected family privacy. Critics argued the rules protected political narratives. Both explanations contained truth. Containment of imagery became inseparable from containment of bodies, a lesser-known media. Policy detail is that regulations on photographing military repatriation changed multiple times across different administrations. The investigation then circled back to the cold, open millions of feet of plastic, not because society suddenly became cruel, because modern civilization became interconnected, accelerated, and bureaucratic. The dead now move through cargo systems built for global speed. Commercial aviation, international disaster. Response, urban morgues, hospital networks. Military logistics, every system values containment. Every system fears disruption. A lesser-known supply chain insight is that emergency response agencies increasingly rely on the same just-in-time logistics frameworks used in commercial distribution networks. That dependence creates fragility. When disasters overwhelm capacity, improvised solutions emerge. Immediately, plastic film becomes a universal answer because it is available everywhere, cheap, flexible, fast, not sacred, practical. One emergency planner admitted that many mass fatality plans quietly assume shortages of specialized equipment during major catastrophes.